World War II is one of the most studied, discussed and dramatized events in human history. Yet, despite endless documentaries, books and, online debates, a handful of myths about the United States Army persist like stubborn ghosts. Maybe it's because Hollywood prefers a good story over a balanced one, or because selective memory has reshaped the facts. Either way, it's time to confront 5 of the most common misconceptions about the United States Army in World War II, and finally set the record straight. Let's start with one of the biggest ones, that the United States Army didn't fight in the Pacific. Most people imagine Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima, storming beaches and pushing through jungles, while the Army fought only in Europe. But that couldn't be further from the truth. The Marines fielded 6 divisions, about 250,000 troops. The United States Army? 22 divisions, almost 2 million soldiers in the same region. The Army didn't just fight in the Pacific, it dominated it. Its troops handled logistics, built bases, ran medical operations, and fought fierce battles across islands like Luzon and New Guinea. The Marines deserve every bit of credit they get, but it was the Army that bore the weight of the Pacific War. So, why does everyone think otherwise? 4 reasons. First, the Marines had incredible public relations. They were seen as elite, daring and cinematic, qualities the press loved. Newspapers back home often covered Marine victories while Army operations received less attention. Even soldiers noticed this. One Army officer joked that the Marines' secret weapon is the Army, since so many photos of Marines in action actually showed Army troops. Second, the Marines led many of the war's most famous assaults, often suffering devastating casualties that captured headlines. Third, the Army was split between multiple fronts, fighting in Europe, North Africa and Asia, while the Marines focused almost exclusively on Japan. And finally, Hollywood sealed the myth. Movies like Flags of Our Fathers, The Pacific and Wind Talkers glorified the Marine image. The truth is, both branches were heroic, but history remembered the one with better press. Now, let's talk about hardware. Myth number 2. The United States Sherman tank was inferior to German armour. The poor Sherman has been insulted for decades, called a death trap or Tommy Cooker. Now, let's talk about hardware. Myth number 2. The United States Sherman tank was inferior to German armour. The poor Sherman has been insulted for decades, called a death trap or Tommy Cooker. The image of thin armour and burning wrecks has become iconic. But that's not the whole story. The Sherman was one of the most effective tanks of the war, not because it was the most powerful, but because it was the most practical. Early Shermans did catch fire when hit, but the Army fixed this quickly with wet stowage, liquid-filled sleeves around ammo racks that prevented explosions. Later versions had thicker armour and better guns. More importantly, these tanks weren't designed for cinematic duels against tigers and panthers. In real combat, US tanks fired on enemy infantry, fortifications and vehicles far more often than on other tanks. Heavy German armour looked terrifying, but most broke down before even reaching battle. The Sherman was reliable, easy to repair, and could be produced in huge numbers, exactly what modern warfare demanded. When people compare a Sherman to a King Tiger, they're comparing a medium tank to a heavy one, a mismatch. It's like comparing a Jeep to a bulldozer. The Germans built monstrous machines that looked impressive on paper but failed in practice. The Americans built tanks that won wars. The Sherman wasn't perfect, but it was fast, flexible and deadly enough to do the job. And it did, from North Africa to Berlin. Next comes myth number 3. The army banned camouflage uniforms because they looked too much like German ones. It sounds believable, but it's fiction. In 1944, the US Army tested frogskin camo uniforms with select divisions in Europe. They weren't widely used, not because of friendly fire incidents, but because the uniforms simply didn't perform well. Next comes myth number 3. The army banned camouflage uniforms because they looked too much like German ones. It sounds believable, but it's fiction. In 1944, the US Army tested frogskin camo uniforms with select divisions in Europe. They weren't widely used, not because of friendly fire incidents, but because the uniforms simply didn't perform well. They faded fast, were expensive to produce, and didn't blend effectively with European terrain. There were friendly fire incidents in Normandy, but, well, they were actually linked to the Army's new solid dark green uniforms, not camouflage ones. The idea that American soldiers were shot by mistake because of camo is pure myth. The test uniforms were quietly discontinued, not banned. The real reason was practical, not dramatic. Now, on to myth number 4. Elite units, like the Airborne and Rangers, did all the heavy lifting. They certainly did their share, paratroopers at Normandy, Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, but, they were a tiny fraction of the overall force. Less than 2% of US troops belonged to these specialized units. The vast majority of the war was fought and won by regular infantry divisions slogging through mud, forests and ruined cities day after day. Less than 2% of US troops belonged to these specialized units. The vast majority of the war was fought and won by regular infantry divisions slogging through mud, forests and ruined cities day after day. Movies like Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan made these elite units legendary, and, well, rightly so. Their stories are incredible. But they also gave the impression that the Airborne alone liberated Europe. The truth is less glamorous. For every paratrooper behind the lines, there were thousands of ordinary soldiers pushing the front forward. The average GI may not make for exciting cinema, but without them, the Allies wouldn't have won a single major campaign. Finally, myth number 5. Women didn't serve in the US Army during World War II. Most people know Rosie the Riveter, symbol of the women who built planes and ships on the home front. Fewer realize that over 350,000 women wore military uniforms. They served as pilots, mechanics, radio operators, medics, drivers and clerks. They weren't in combat roles, but they were often close to the front. And, some paid with their lives. Most people know Rosie the Riveter, the symbol of the women who built planes and ships on the home front. But, fewer realize that over 350,000 women actually wore military uniforms. They served as pilots, mechanics, radio operators, medics, drivers and clerks. And while they weren't in combat roles, they were often close to the front. And sadly, some paid with their lives. Each branch had its own women's corps, the Army's WWIIs, or Women's Army Corps, the Air Force's WASPs. women Air Force service pilots, the Navy's Waves, the Marine Corps, Women's Reserve, and the Coast Guard spars. They ferried aircraft, decoded enemy messages, forecasted weather-repaired engines, and honestly kept the entire military machine running. Some were captured. Some never came home. When the Women's Armed Services Integration Act passed in 1948, it didn't actually start women's service. It simply made permanent what they had already proven, that they belonged. So there you have it. 5 enduring myths about the US Army, stripped of legend and polished with fact. From the Pacific to the European fronts, from the Sherman steel hull to the WWII typewriter, the real story of America's war machine is far more nuanced and, frankly, far more impressive than the Hollywood version. Myths are easy. Truth takes a little digging. But when it comes to history, it's always worth the excavation.